The terrifying discovery on a Texas morning, 2008, November 15, 2008. Dawn was just breaking over the sprawling flatlands on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, where the air always felt tinged with dew and a tinge of sweet grass. Bill Hawkins, a weather-beaten farmer with hands rough from years on the plow, was up before the sun, as was his habit. He poured himself a scalding cup of Folgers, tugged on his faded baseball cap, and headed for the fields to check on the sugarcane, a ritual nearly as old as the land itself. The fields around here were quiet before sunrise, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the crunch of dried stalks underfoot. The air was brisk, and a morning mist clung low, turning the farm into a silver-veiled patchwork. Bill's breath turned to fog as he strolled along, scanning the neat rows for signs of wildlife or trespassers. It was then, just as he paused to brush away a wild rabbit, that the morning peace was broken by the sharp tang of something rotten. At first Bill wrinkled his nose, thinking one of the farm dogs had dragged a carcass somewhere nearby. But the smell grew thicker, almost chemical, invading his nostrils with such insistence he found himself gagging. Driven by equal parts concern and country curiosity, Bill followed the scent to a remote corner of his property where the sugarcane grew wild and dense. There, a jumble of withered leaves, out of place almost as though deliberately heaped, caught his eye. Bill's heart thudded in his chest. The closer he crept, the more swarms of black flies scattered and reformed, painting the air with a feverish buzz. Kneeling, Bill hesitated for just a split second, the old fear of the unknown running along his spine. But he was a Texan, steady nerves were a birthright. He reached out, hands trembling just a little, and brushed aside the brittle thatch of cane leaves. What he saw next would haunt him for years to come, a human body, lying face down, its clothing filthy and torn, but, worst of all, where the head should have been, there was nothing but stained dirt and a ring of matted grass. The shock paralyzed Bill for an instant. For a fleeting moment, the everyday reality of farm life seemed to recede, replaced by a churning sense of dread. He staggered back, hot bile rising in his throat, and tried, almost comically he'd admit later, to convince himself it was some elaborate, awful prank. But there was no doubt in his mind, the person was dead, the violence unmistakable. Ruins of what appeared to be a purse or bag lay nearby, its contents torn and scattered in the grass. Flies blanketed the scene, indifferent to the horror. The rising sun cast long, ghastly shadows, illuminating the body as the morning mist began to dissipate. Bill, breathing hard, stumbled to his feet, nearly dropping his coffee cup, and sprinted back toward the house, shouting with every last ounce of his voice for help, for neighbors, for someone to make sense of it all. That scream carried over the flatlands, shattering the dawn stillness and setting off a ripple of panic that would soon envelop the quiet farming community. Panic ripples across rural Texas. Word spread like wildfire across the small farming community. The first to respond were Bill's closest neighbors, roused from their own early morning routines by the strange, desperate echoes of his shouts. His cries carried urgency, a tone that simply did not fit the steady, predictable rhythms of rural life. By the time a handful of folks reached the edge of the sugarcane field, Bill was ghost pale, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the grisly discovery. It took only seconds for word to leap from farm to farm. Cell phones buzzed with frantic calls and, in that age-old custom, more than a few families simply dropped everything, jumped in pickup trucks and tore across dusty roads to see what trouble had upended the peace. Women in gingham, men in worn denim, and kids who should have been heading to school instead clustered on the edge of the field, shielding their eyes and murmuring prayers. The arrival of sirens, first from the county sheriff and then from local police, only fueled the frenzy. The quiet was replaced by the churn of engines, the crunch of boots, and the persistent low hum of worried conversation. Crime scene tapes soon snapped in the breeze, yet the urgency remained palpable. People clung to the fence lines, whispering theories and speculations that grew wilder by the minute. Was it a drifter? Or had the violence come from within, someone they knew? Reporters from the local news vans emblazoned with station logos never seen this far from the city, rolled onto the scene by midday, cameras aimed like hungry vultures. Fear leapt from person to person. Some folks double-checked doors and windows for the first time in years. Children were kept close, no one allowed to stray even across the pasture. Over fried chicken dinners and in pews at the Little White Church, the conversations went in circles, equal parts speculation and prayer, grief and fear commingled. For generations the community had weathered drought, fire, and even the threat of the occasional tornado, but nothing in living memory compared to this. A neighbor finding a headless body in broad daylight right there between the cane and the cotton. That night, as the Texas stars burned cold and remote over the fields, the entire region pulled its blankets close. Unease shifted in every household, an invisible fog, thicker than the morning dew. The safety of rural life felt suddenly and irreparably changed. This murder wasn't just a crime, it was a rupture in the quiet, a nightmare made real, and everyone wondered if life on the prairie would ever feel the same again. Investigating the victim's identity. As the shock ricocheted through the county, the sheriff's department moved into methodical, uneasy action. The body, female, likely between 25 and 30, presented an immediate challenge: decapitated, disfigured, stripped of anything that might speak of her life. In the chill of that November morning, deputies laid down markers and combed the field for clues, each square foot raked over with a sense of somber urgency. First responders struggled with a mixture of revulsion and the heavy responsibility of extracting whatever story this victim could still tell. Forensic examiners worked exhaustively at the scene. Photographs were snapped, measurements taken, and a painstaking search for personal belongings began, anything at all that might point to who the woman had been. There was no ID, no wallet, only fragments of torn clothing, a half-burnt receipt, and a single broken necklace provided leads. The county coroner estimated she had been dead less than a week. The body bore signs of strangulation, a dark bruise around the throat, but no other injuries or bruises to suggest a struggle. The head's absence rendered the identification process agonizingly more complex, and soon it became clear. There was little chance anyone could say who she was just by looking. Working quickly, investigators released a description to the media and put out calls to neighboring towns, hospitals, and missing persons records. They cataloged the victim's clothes: a once green dress, now soiled and torn, nondescript shoes, a silver ring with an etching almost worn away by time. Sketch artists and forensic specialists tried to reconstruct what could, but every step seemed to lead only to more questions. The local hospital was contacted, as were nearby counties, on the chance that someone might be searching for a missing woman. Days passed in tense silence. No one came forward at first. Then on the evening of November 17th, a middle-aged woman arrived at the sheriff's office, her hands shaking as she clutched a photograph of her daughter, a 30-year-old woman who hadn't answered her phone in days. Her voice trembled as she described her daughter's clothes, the way she always wore a silver ring, the necklace she never took off. Details trickled out: an address, friends in town, a job at the local theater. The deputies listened, comparing notes, hearts growing heavier as the similarities added up. It took a gut-twisting visit to the morgue, a half-hopeful, half-terrified scan of the meager possessions found with the body, and a confirmation that shattered the woman's remaining composure. Her daughter, missing, vibrant, never thinking her name would be in the news this way, was the headless victim found in the cane. The truth broke hearts across the community. Now the investigation shifted into high gear, not just the mystery of a life lost, but the question of who could carry out such a calculated, brutal crime against one of their own. Chasing the trail of clues. The days that followed the identification of the victim brought a tense, almost fevered sense of purpose to the investigation. For the Austin Sheriff's Office, this was no routine homicide. It was a puzzle with almost no edges. A woman killed and stripped of her very identity, left in a field with only scraps of her life scattered around her, in a town unaccustomed to such horror. Detectives started where most murder cases begin, with the victim's recent history, her relationships, her work, and any conflicts lurking beneath the surface. Emily Carter, as the young woman was now known, had been a rising actress at the City Arts Theater in Austin, a fact both promising and problematic. The world of small-town theater could be insular and dramatic, with alliances and rivalries as old as the playbills themselves. The first layer of the investigation centered around Emily's close friends and co-workers. Detectives visited her shared apartment, questioning her roommate Sarah, who was visibly shaken and anxious. She spoke of Emily's recent moodiness, long phone calls with a mysterious man, and her growing preoccupation with an upcoming audition. Sarah also revealed that Emily had been receiving odd gestures after performances, anonymous letters and small tokens left on her car, which she had dismissed as superfan whimsy, but which now seemed far more sinister. The police took meticulous notes, collecting every fragment from Emily's room: theater flyers, makeup kits, greeting cards, a ticket stub from a late-night film. One theater friend mentioned seeing Emily talking heatedly with Andrew Grant, the charming but notoriously fickle owner of a Broadway-style venue downtown. Initial interviews with Andrew yielded little. He seemed genuinely shocked, denied any romantic involvement, and provided clear evidence of being in New York during the critical date range. The scrutiny then turned to Tom Lee, Emily's lead co-star, a charismatic man with a complicated personal life. Multiple staff at the theater witnessed awkward tension between Tom, Emily, and Tom's wife Linda. When pressed, Tom reluctantly admitted to a brief but intense attraction, but insisted they had cooled things off weeks before the murder. Linda, meanwhile, had a temper, and was rumored to have caused several scenes at the theater. Ironically, Linda had gone missing the very night after the murder, failing to return home and turning her cell phone off, a fact the police immediately flagged as highly suspicious. Surveillance cameras from around the theater and Emily's apartment complex were pored over frame by frame. The investigators traced rental car receipts, scanned emails and phone logs, and worked with forensic IT specialists to retrieve deleted messages. A forensic sweep turned up a partial print on one of the shredded notes Emily had tucked into her bag, potentially a game-changer if it could be matched. With mounting pressure from both the community and the media, detectives expanded the net, reaching out to bus depots, ride-sharing records, and nearby town police stations. Everyone who'd interacted with Emily in the week before her death was summoned for interviews. Old friends, ex-boyfriends, theater patrons, even baristas from her go-to cafe. Bit by painstaking bit, a picture began to form. Emily's life was neither as glamorous nor as simple as a play's opening set. She'd confided in her mother about someone following her after late rehearsals but had brushed it off. She'd also been unusually secretive about a recent argument with a jealous woman, but refused to share details. Each lead pointed somewhere, but none brought them closer to the killer, yet. The weight of unanswered questions, frustrated townsfolk, and a growing media circus made the search for Emily's truth feel both vital and, at times, nearly impossible. But nobody in Austin was ready to give up, not with a murderer on the loose, and with the quiet hope that the next small clue might finally expose the darkness hanging over their town. Emily Carter, Stage Lights and Shattered Dreams. Emily Carter's journey to the City Arts Theater in Austin was far from ordinary. Born and raised amidst the cotton fields and winding bayous of rural Louisiana, Emily was always something of a dreamer. As a child, she would perform Shakespeare in the backyard, turning laundry lines into velvet curtains and old crates into stage props. Her mother, a kindly Sunday school teacher, would often peer out the window and watch Emily act out each scene, sometimes with an imaginary audience of fireflies. Throughout high school, Emily was the heart and soul of her drama club. She was fearless, playing everything from Lady Macbeth to comic relief. Teachers described her as a once-in-a-lifetime student, someone whose presence brightened the room, even on gray days. But small-town life was never enough for Emily. She pored over issues of Playbill and clippings from the New York Times, circling listings for auditions she knew she'd one day attend. Her father, a stoic, weather-beaten man of faith, wanted her to become a nurse, like her aunt. Emily loved him dearly, but the call of the stage was stronger than any sense of obligation. At 18, with only a suitcase full of thrift shop dresses and a battered copy of King Lear, Emily boarded a bus to Texas. Austin, boasting both indie music and a vibrant theater community, felt like home the moment she stepped onto its sun-soaked sidewalks. She moved into a cramped walk-up on Main Street, waitressed at odd hours, and spent every spare moment chasing stage jobs. Failure was a familiar companion, rejections outnumbered callbacks, her bank balance sometimes threatened to slip below zero, and nights were filled with hopeful scribbles in her faded blue journal. But in the spring of 2006, Emily caught her first real break. She was cast as Ophelia in a fringe theater production of Hamlet. Critics called her performance luminous, and fellow performers spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones about her depth and commitment. Word got around. Directors started to phone. By 2007, Emily had become a fixture of Austin's indie arts community. Her name scrawled in quick, excited hand across playbills and posters in coffee shops all over town. Emily's charisma drew people to her. She was magnetic off stage too, warm, approachable, the sort of person who remembered birthdays and had a knack for sitting with co-stars until dawn, talking about life and chasing away doubt. Friends said she lit up from the inside out, and, in quieter circles, admired her ability to remain grounded amid success. But fame bred complications. By 2008, talent alone wasn't enough to shield her from jealousy, gossip, and the political undertow of small-time show business. Rivals whispered about her special treatment. Younger actresses envied her starring roles and playwrights jockeyed for her approval. Emily's closest confidant was Sarah Taylor, her roommate and scene partner. They met during a stage reading of A Streetcar Named Desire, instantly gravitating toward each other over their mutual penchant for late-night tacos and shared memories of restless southern childhoods. Sarah described Emily as a force of nature with a tender soul, saying she often played peacemaker during cast disputes and never missed a chance to lift someone else's spirits. Yet beneath the warmth lay an undercurrent of restlessness. Emily's journal entries from 2008 paint the portrait of a woman struggling under the dual weight of ambition and expectation. Audiences adored her, but critics sometimes dismissed her emotional style as too earnest. She longed to break out of Austin to try her hand in Los Angeles or even New York. Money was always tight. Even as the city printed her face on festival flyers, she skipped meals and rode buses across town to audition for commercials that barely paid rent. Friends noticed the fatigue, chalking it up to the grind, but some suspected there were deeper worries she never voiced. Her relationships were just as tangled as her career. She navigated a series of short-lived romances, some explosive, others quietly heartbreaking. Emily kept her private life closely guarded, but a few insiders whispered about a complicated love triangle involving a charismatic stage manager and one of her leading men. Gossips in theater circles spun stories, but Emily herself, quick with a nervous laugh, always expertly steered the conversation back to her craft. She'd fallen hard for Tom Lee, an older actor lauded for his classical training but infamous for erratic moods and a jealous wife. Their chemistry lit up the stage and set tongues wagging. Emily cherished their moments alone, quiet after-parties where stories flowed freely, or hushed walks home from the theater when Austin's streets lay empty but electric with possibility. But Tom's marriage was a storm brewing on the horizon. His wife, Linda, was a familiar face at the theater, watchful, withholding, always there in the wings. More than once Linda had confronted Emily backstage, suspicion and bitterness coloring every word. Tension dripped from the green room walls. Emily tried to keep boundaries, to focus only on rehearsals, but the lines between acting and reality blurred in dangerous ways. Despite the complications, Emily pressed ahead. Her resilience inspired many. Even during the darkest weeks, when critics panned her work or old classmates from Louisiana sent stinging letters of concern, Emily never considered abandoning the stage. She was, as she often told Sarah, born for this, ready to let the world judge her so long as she could keep telling stories. "If you can claim a patch of light for yourself, even if it's borrowed, you fight to keep it," she wrote in her journal. The Mysterious Man, the first real lead. In the weeks following Emily Carter's tragic death, the investigation felt like trying to read a book where half the chapters had been torn away. Detectives combed through her belongings, her social circles, and her recently hectic audition schedule, desperate for that first promising thread. It was Sarah Taylor, Emily's roommate, who provided the earliest spark of hope, a name that kept surfacing: Andrew Grant. Sarah described Andrew as a figure looming on the edges of Emily's life, oddly present yet never fully visible. He was the owner of a small but ambitious Broadway-style theater in Austin. A man with a reputation as a risk-taker, someone who banked his modest fortune on unconventional plays and fledgling talents. Andrew was, by outward appearances, nondescript, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with perpetually scuffed shoes, whose charm flickered only in carefully selected company, but beneath the surface whispers swirled. Emily and Andrew's professional relationship had intensified leading up to her death. Sarah recalled late-night phone calls, sometimes lasting hours, drifting through the thin apartment walls as Emily and Andrew discussed script changes, performance nuances, or theater funding crises. There were arguments, voices rising, falling, ending with one or both parties abruptly hanging up. There were also moments of laughter, laden with an intimacy that made Sarah and eventually the detectives wonder if the connection ran deeper than business. Andrew's name appeared frequently in Emily's call logs and emails. When detectives arrived at the Cascade Theater, Andrew Grant greeted them with a wary, tight-lipped politeness. He claimed to be devastated by Emily's death, describing her as a beacon of raw talent, the kind you'd wager your savings on. He explained, in that earnest yet guarded way of seasoned theater folk, that he'd been in New York the week of her murder, attending industry meetings and scouting talent. Flight records and his travel companion, a junior producer, seemed to corroborate the alibi. Yet, as the detectives noted, there remained the nagging possibility that someone had masterfully engineered the perfect exit. Peers in the Austin theater scene painted Andrew as a complicated man, shrewd yet generous, empathetic but sometimes chillingly pragmatic. Some saw him as a mentor, others as a rival. A few whispered that he played favorites, and that Emily had for months been the star pupil. After her death, rumors bloomed that Andrew's affection for Emily spilled beyond the footlights. The two sometimes spotted huddled in shadowed corridors after rehearsals, their conversations too intense to simply be about art. Yet nobody could point to concrete evidence of a love affair, let alone a motive for murder. As for Emily herself, those close to her perceived Andrew as a mentor, a benefactor, someone whose high standards, praise, and willingness to gamble on her ambition gave Emily the fuel to reach higher. But ambition, as detectives knew well, can breed jealousy. As Andrew poured out his recollections to investigators, cracks in his composure became noticeable. He described resentments among the cast, petty rivalries that erupted after cast lists were posted, and the sting of overseeing fragile egos in an underfunded world. "Everyone wants a piece of the limelight," he muttered, "and not everyone is fit to share it." To unravel Andrew's role further, detectives scoured theater records and personal correspondence. Emily's text messages fluctuated between warmth and tension, late-night reassurances, urgent requests for meetings, cryptic apologies. A series of unsent emails found on Emily's laptop included one draft in which she struggled to confront Andrew about a troubling incident following a rehearsal. A vague reference, but one that spurred police to probe deeper. They interviewed cast and crew, piecing together a timeline of Andrew's interactions with Emily over the past several months. There were reports of heated arguments over casting decisions, disagreements about marketing strategies for the winter play, and, most notably, a tense standoff after an after-party where Emily had left in tears. A makeup artist recalled finding Emily trembling backstage, whispering about feeling watched and vowing to keep her distance from certain people, though she never clarified whether Andrew was included in that group. Cold, hard evidence proved elusive. Andrew's fingerprints dotted Emily's dressing room, her scripts, her car door, none out of the ordinary for a director. Surveillance footage confirmed his hasty departure for New York, and ticket stubs squared with his own statements. If anything, his attempts to distance himself from rumors of impropriety made him even more inscrutable. He was a man both in the thick of things and forever outside them, navigating life like one of his plays, never quite breaking the fourth wall. Yet police felt obligated to continue pressing. Andrew was re-interviewed, subjected to polygraphs, pressed for minute details. His answers were cool, sometimes cagey. He repeatedly emphasized the boundaries of his professional relationship with Emily, but could not conceal his anger at being treated as a suspect. Several times he almost lashed out at detectives. "I'm grieving for a young woman who meant a hell of a lot to the whole city, and you'd rather hunt ghosts than her killer." What struck lead detective Harmony Wells was that, in Andrew, ambition and regret seemed hopelessly entangled. She saw flashes of a man mourning opportunities lost and a reputation now forever smudged by proximity to tragedy. Despite a near-airtight alibi, the reverberations of suspicion would dog Andrew for years, the first in a long line of suspects orbiting the mysterious, violent end of Emily Carter's Broadway dreams. A tangled love triangle and tragedy unfolds. It was after Emily Carter's name appeared in city headlines, painted in bold, somber letters, that the stories began to unravel beneath the bright lights of Austin's theater district. The days following her death exposed not just a promising actress, but a young woman at the crossroads of passion, ambition, and heartbreak, as well as the others who revolved around her orbit. Among the close-knit cast and crew of Emily's latest production, rumors ran rampant. Emily and Tom Lee, her charismatic co-star, had become inseparable on and off stage. What began as chemistry for an audience grew into countless late-night rehearsals, private script readings, and extended drinks at local dive bars after curtain call. It was the kind of bond that got noticed, even in a world where actors were expected to blur the lines between reality and fiction. Their laughter backstage, familiar glances, and the subtle way they seemed to anchor each other's presence were impossible to hide for those who worked alongside them. They brought each other's best performances out, one ensemble member recalled, but when the spotlights dimmed, their connection was more personal than professional. Yet Tom was a married man. His wife, Linda Lee, was a striking presence, once beloved as a young ingenue, now the backbone of many productions as assistant director and sometimes stage manager. Everyone in the company understood that Linda was not only Tom's partner in life in the theater, but also his fiercest supporter. and, it seemed, his most watchful critic. She hovered in the wings during run-throughs, her eyes rarely leaving Tom or Emily. Sometimes she kept a professional distance. Other nights she would join the cast for end-of-rehearsal drinks, her energy sparking and her laughter a little too sharp. Yet there were moments, especially when Tom and Emily lingered a touch too long over closing lines, that a chill entered Linda's words, and her hands stayed clenched tight around a wine glass. Friends noticed Linda's arrival around the theater grew more frequent and intense as performances neared. She scheduled impromptu meetings with Tom, loitered near the wings during rehearsals, and occasionally made pointed remarks if Emily flubbed a line or sat alone with Tom in a darkened auditorium. A makeup artist confided that Linda once quietly demanded Emily respect the boundaries that come with a ring. But if the theater was Emily's passion, it was also a battleground. Tom seemed caught in the undertow of attention, desperate to keep his marriage from unraveling while being drawn to Emily's spark, a quality he found both exhilarating and impossible to resist. Emily, for her part, was torn between her loyalty to her principles and her growing attraction to Tom. She was ambitious but never malicious, confiding to her best friend Sarah that she felt guilty for wanting something she shouldn't, but falling wasn't ever a thing she scheduled. The love triangle soon radiated stress well beyond the three directly involved. The production's director became uneasy with what he described as dangerous distractions backstage. Tech crew gossiped in the shadows, worried the main cast's drama would spill into their carefully choreographed performances. Rumors swirled that Linda had intercepted text messages sent between Tom and Emily, and once even confronted Emily in the dressing rooms, a confrontation muffled by closed doors but loud enough to unsettle those listening from behind the heavy velvet curtains. It wasn't long before these personal entanglements began to affect the show itself. Rehearsals grew tense, lines were flubbed and stage cues missed. The backstage camaraderie that once buoyed the entire cast started to unravel. Angry whispers replaced laughter. Emily's performances developed a sharper edge, filled with a vulnerability that audiences lauded, but that insiders sensed was drawn straight from wounds cut less by the script and more by real heartbreak. Tom grew jumpy. Linda oscillated between icy formality and volcanic outbursts, especially when she saw other company members offer Emily support or sympathy. Outside the theater, the trio's lives became even messier. Tom, racked with guilt, attempted to fix everything by pulling away from Emily, but the further he tried to distance himself, the more Linda pressed him for honesty, and the more Emily slipped into isolation. Sarah described Emily as haunted during the final weeks before her death, spiraling in private, questioning her choices, leaving rehearsals abruptly or staring at her reflection for long stretches in the green room. Yet despite the heartbreak, Emily seemed unwilling to quit the production, maybe out of pride, maybe out of love, or maybe, Sarah thought, out of a belief that the drama on stage might still have a happier ending than the one off stage. Linda, sensing her marriage fraying, became more desperate. She followed Tom's car after rehearsals, kept a log of phone calls, and started showing up unannounced at places Emily was known to frequent. The coffee shop near the theater, the small park where Emily liked to read her scripts. Friends described Linda as shadowed by paranoia, a once strong and even-tempered woman now teetering on the edge, fueled by jealousy and despair. Eventually, the tension reached a fever pitch after an ill-fated closing night party. Tom and Emily were seen arguing outside in a parking lot, their voices heated, their faces drawn. Linda, who had left the gathering early, texted Tom incessantly that night, text messages police would later find during their investigation. That same week, Linda was overheard tearfully telling a friend, "If I lose Tom, I've lost everything." Emily's bright trajectory, once defined by talent and grit, became tethered to an emotional crossfire she couldn't escape. In her journal, pages later found by detectives, she wrote, "It's not just the roles we play on stage, but the ones we play in each other's lives that leave marks, some scenes you can't rewrite." By the time Emily Carter's life was abruptly and violently ended, the love triangle had left no one untouched. The theater mourned more than an actress. They mourned a friend and a future that might have been. Linda and Tom's marriage lay in ruins, their private anguish now fodder for small-town gossip and investigative scrutiny. People who once believed heartbreak lived only in stories realized the sharpest tragedies occurred after the house lights went dark. And as detectives pieced together alibis and motives, it became clear the human heart, like the best theater, could inspire both the greatest passion and the most irrevocable ruin. Linda Lee, the shadow beneath the spotlight. On the surface, Linda Lee was the kind of woman who belonged on stage as much as behind the scenes. Her beauty was both classic and imposing, the kind that made people take notice even in a room full of glimmering lights and glamorous actors. But for all the grace she wore in public, those closest to her would whisper about the intense energy simmering just beneath, a ferocity born of ambition, love, and a painful, quietly deep insecurity. Linda had been an actress once, celebrated in her early 20s by Austin's tight-knit theater community. She dazzled in ingenue roles, her voice soaring with innocence and hope, her eyes filled with embers that promised something more complex lurking beneath. Back then, Tom Lee first noticed her from the wings, mesmerized not only by her talent but by the quiet steel he sensed behind her gentleness. Their romance blossomed over script readings and late-night scene rehearsals, culminating in a wedding that seemed for a brief bright moment to promise happily ever after. Years passed, and Linda's star faded, not from lack of talent, but from the slow, relentless tides that tug at any performer, missed opportunities, the shifting tides of audience taste, and the relentless demands of survival. When children never came, she poured her excess love and energy into her marriage, and eventually, into theater administration. As Tom's career heated up and he landed leading man roles, Linda became the backbone of the theater company, assistant director, organizer, emotional caretaker, and guardian of the troupe's fragile peace. But the brighter Tom's star burned, the longer Linda's own shadow grew, especially as Tom's attention strayed toward younger, dynamic co-stars. At first, Linda dismissed rumors of flirtations and brushed aside jokes about Tom's latest crush. But when Emily Carter arrived at the City Arts Theater, Linda's worries bloomed into a gnawing, ever-present ache. There was no mistaking the intensity between Emily and Tom, the lingering glances, the way Emily's performance sharpened when Tom was on stage, the late-night rehearsals that ended with their laughter drifting down dark hallways. Friends tried to assure Linda it was nothing she hadn't seen before. "The stage is a jealous god," an old actor once told her, "and it breeds jealous worshippers." For Linda, every new production brought new fears. She tried to outwork her suspicions, doubling her hours, managing costumes, smoothing bruised egos, and volunteering for thankless tasks, but each effort left her feeling more invisible. Still, she maintained composure on the outside, her instructions clipped and professional during staff meetings, her smile pleasant but guarded at cast parties. Yet the strain began to show. Linda's laughter faltered. Her comments, once breezy, took on a sharper edge. She was often seen alone backstage, watching Tom and Emily with an expression that mixed longing, regret, and something darker. One autumn afternoon, Linda confronted Emily alone beneath the flyloft, the smell of sawdust and old velvet thick in the air. Her tone was calm, but her cheeks were flushed and her voice trembled. "Do you know what it's like," she asked, "to see the man you love falling for someone else in slow motion, every day, a little bit more?" Emily, taken aback, insisted their friendship was nothing more. Still, Linda left that exchange more convinced than ever that she was losing Tom, not just as a husband, but as the star around which her own world revolved. In the weeks before the murder, Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She began to show up unexpectedly at rehearsals, lurking in the back row. She trailed Tom's car after late-night meetings, double-checked his phone, and tried, with a growing sense of dread, to find proof she could not unsee. She confided in an old friend, Jackie, that she sometimes fantasized about what would happen if Emily simply disappeared. "That girl's tearing my marriage apart. She doesn't even care what she's doing." The seeds of obsession took root. Linda oscillated between spells of contrition, cooking elaborate dinners, leaving hopeful notes on Tom's pillow, and bouts of anger that left doors slamming and arguments echoing through their modest home. She lost weight, her sleep became restless. Her eyes, once quick to laughter, now darted anxiously in shadowed corners of the theater. Friends noticed her transformation and tiptoed around her volatility. "She's not herself," Jackie would later say to detectives. "It's like watching someone clutch a handful of sand. They squeeze tighter, but it keeps slipping away." What the public never saw, and what perhaps even Tom didn't fully comprehend, was the internal war raging within Linda, the clash between pride and panic, between the desire to fight for love and the terror that nothing she did would ever be enough. In her journals, later seized as evidence, Linda wrote raw, aching lines. "I am both furious at them and furious at myself for not being enough, for loving him so much I could break." When the police finally questioned Linda, she played the role she knew best, the wronged wife, composed and righteous, insisting she only wanted the best for Tom and for the theater. But beneath the surface, her grief and rage simmered. When Emily's death became public knowledge, Linda was among the first to comfort her fellow cast members. She brought homemade cinnamon bread to the theater, offered tissues and reassurances, and kept her answers soft and vague when detectives asked about her whereabouts. Only Tom saw the deep fatigue in her eyes and the haunted way she now retreated from his touch. Her final unraveling came quietly but decisively. Pressured by mounting evidence, Linda fled Austin overnight, leaving only a cryptic note for her husband. By the time authorities tracked her down in Chicago, she was a shell of the poised woman they remembered, a cocktail of grief, guilt, and stubborn pride that refused to let her surrender easily. During interrogation, she pivoted between denial and desperate justification, blaming Emily, herself, and at times forces far beyond her control. Her tangled confession would emerge only slowly as the realization dawned that her world, the marriage, the theater, the carefully constructed persona, had collapsed under the weight of jealousy. In the end, Linda Lee was neither entirely monster nor martyr. She was a woman whose longing for love, security, and validation ultimately consumed her. The Austin theater community, once her source of purpose and belonging, would remember her not for standing in the spotlight but for the darkness she allowed to overtake her. Her story, woven from hope and heartbreak, would linger on long after the curtains fell. The hunt for the suspect. From the moment Linda Lee's name entered the rolling tides of suspicion, the investigation shifted into high gear, its tone morphing from methodical to relentless. Detectives led by Harmony Wells refused to be lulled into a false sense of closure by the emotional volatility surging through the theater community. Instead, they tracked everything with the obsessive focus that only a small-town scandal can inspire. Tom Lee, the shattered husband and anchor to much of Linda's private world, became both ally and obstacle. Through the pounding headache of grief and outrage, Tom handed over what sparse information he could. He confessed to last seeing Linda on the edge of a breakdown, her hands trembling as she packed hurriedly for a trip that had the desperate air of someone searching for escape. She said she needed time away, he muttered in the interview room, eyes rimmed red and distant. She said she couldn't sleep, not after what happened to Emily. I thought she was just grieving, but now, I don't know. Linda's closest confidant, Jackie Martinez, a longtime friend from the theater, painted another picture. Jackie revealed that Linda had crashed on her couch for 2 nights before abruptly announcing she was heading to Chicago. She said Austin felt toxic. She needed to disappear just for a while. For detectives, this planted a clear geographic target. They began canvassing bus stations, combing through ticket stubs, and calling contacts with the Chicago Police Department. Warrants for credit card activity, cell phone records, and security footage unfolded a digital path north. Linda's credit card pinged at roadside diners, a motel on the outskirts of Dallas, then again at a gas station 2 hours from the Illinois border. Every transaction painted a picture of a fugitive not running so much from law, but from the misery she had wrought around her. Surveillance images captured her alone, hair pulled back beneath a nondescript ball cap, eyes darting and posture hunched as if waiting for every shadow to leap at her. All the while, the emotional stakes in Austin soared. Reporters stalked the homes of both the Lee and Carter families, snapping pixelated images of drawn curtains and anxious faces. The theater itself became both shrine and cautionary tale, a place where bouquets of fading roses were left outside the box office, and rumors were exchanged in frantic, stage-whispered breaths backstage. Inside police headquarters, whiteboards overflowed with timelines, arrows, and photographs connected by angry red yarn. Linda in the center, a whirlpool of speculation. As word spread of Linda's flight from Austin, the media ran with reckless abandon. Morning talk shows debated her innocence. Crime bloggers dissected every possible angle. An actress turned assistant, a marriage splintered, a promising young woman dead. Harmony Wells knew that the clock was ticking. Every hour Linda remained unfound gave her that much more time to slip into anonymity, or worse, to concoct a new narrative to explain her involvement. Detectives coordinated with authorities in Dallas, St. Louis, and Chicago. Collaboration wasn't always easy. Jurisdictions clashed, time zones lagged, and not every department prioritized a Texas theater scandal over their local emergencies. But the haunting nature of the case, the severed threads of a promising life, the fame of the Lee name within certain theater circles, kept the chase alive. By day 7, Harmony herself was running almost entirely on caffeine and adrenaline. She found a rhythm in the monotony. Call, follow up, adjust course, repeat. She pored over printouts from Easy Pass systems and ATM withdrawal logs, looking for an anomaly. Was Linda heading for family, friends, or simply vanishing for the sake of solitude, punishing herself for what she had lost? Each theory required exhaustive elimination. Back at headquarters, Tom Lee was racked with guilt and confusion. Was he to blame for Linda's unraveling? Should he have suspected her anguish might take such a tragic and criminal turn? Sometimes he stayed into the early hours, silently staring at photographs from brighter days, his wife at the center of cast parties, their smiles genuine, their troubles hidden behind stage makeup and applause. He gave police every clue he could, but the distance between heartbreak and hard evidence sometimes felt impossibly vast. Meanwhile, Harmony's team delved into Linda's psychological profile as part of their manhunt. Drawing from counseling records, testimonies from theater colleagues, and even snippets from Linda's half-kept journal, they built a portrait of a woman spiraling, her actions an unpredictable combination of deliberate planning and frantic flailing. They reached out to motels across the Midwest with Linda's picture. Some clerks shrugged, others claimed to recognize the haunted woman who paid in cash and avoided eye contact. Piecing together the trail, detectives focused on the outskirts of Chicago, where tips began to converge. Chicago PD picked up Linda at a rundown bus terminal just after sunrise on a gray Thursday. She was clutching a battered duffel, exhaustion stamped deep into her features. For a moment she surrendered without protest, her only question, a whisper, "Is Tom okay?" The reality of arrest, the hard metal of the handcuffs, seemed almost a relief after the paranoia of running. She didn't ask about Emily. Back in Austin, the news of Linda's capture sent yet another ripple through an already traumatized town. Detective Wells flew to Chicago for the extradition, finding Linda worn thin but guarded. Linda cycled through moods, compliant and silent during transport, icily defensive when questioned by police, tearful when left alone. She offered conflicting stories, at first denying any role in Emily's death, then implicating a supposed stalker from the theater, a man named Ethan Daniels, whose own history of obsession with Emily was well known among the troupe. Detective Wells's approach was meticulous. She reviewed every statement Linda made, cross-checking times, dates, and possible corroboration in Austin and Chicago. She examined Linda's discarded cell phone, found in a Greyhound Depot locker, scraping it for messages, call logs, and GPS history. The more she probed, the more she encountered not only the retreating shadows of a woman wrestling her own guilt, but also the outward blast radius of the case. Allies, enemies, and bystanders whose own stories collided at the crossroads of ambition, betrayal, and loss. Interrogation became a psychological duel. Linda's defenses slid between practiced innocence and brittle outrage. "I loved Tom. I wanted my marriage back. I never meant for it to go that far." Her testimony regarding Ethan Daniels was riddled with inconsistencies. At times she insisted Ethan had acted alone. At others she admitted she'd encouraged him in vague, desperate ways. Detectives brought in Ethan for questioning, and his account, marked by a confusing mix of adoration and resentment toward Emily, only deepened the complexity of the case. Meanwhile, Austin's theater community fractured under the weight of scandal. Some rushed to Linda's defense, remembering her as a talented artist and loyal friend. Others cited moments of jealousy and manipulation that now felt like warnings in hindsight. Even as detectives built their timeline, every new revelation was met with gasps, anger, and exhausted sorrow from those who once shared in the idyllic camaraderie of plays and parties. As the investigation pressed forward, Harmony Wells coordinated with both legal and mental health professionals to prepare for the trial ahead. She sought to parse the tangle of motives and actions, intent, opportunity, emotional collapse. Forensic evidence from the scene, digital footprints retrieved from Linda's laptop, and testimony from those entwined in the deadly love triangle formed the heart of the prosecution's narrative. The city watched as pieces snapped into place, receipts matched phone records, surveillance footage coincided with Linda's claims, and previously overlooked witness statements finally made sense within the expanded tragic context. But the hunt for Linda Lee was more than the mere tracking of a fugitive. It was the exhumation of every secret, lie, and unresolved longing held beneath the theater's flickering lights. In the end, the process was as much about understanding Linda's psychological collapse and the ripple effect of choices made in desperation, as it was about following her physical trail. By the time Harmony saw Linda again in the courtroom, both women seemed changed by the journey. There were no dramatic reveals or cinematic confessions, just a battered succession of facts, painful, irrefutable, and damning. For Austin, the hunt for the suspect would become the cautionary tale that lingered in community memory long after the footlights dimmed, a stark reminder of how quickly love, longing, and regret can spiral well beyond the stage. The truth behind the velvet curtain. For weeks, the mystery of Emily Carter's brutal murder had been a black hole at the center of Austin's world, sucking in speculation and rumor with equal fury. Now, as the police investigation drew together its final fragments, the real story came into focus, one more twisted and tragic than even the most tabloid-thirsty gossips had imagined. The truth, once it began to surface, was more operatic than any tale ever performed on the city's proudest stages. It began innocently, if such a word could be used at all in a saga so poisoned by insecurity, jealousy, and desperate love. Ethan Daniels, known around the City Arts Theater as a somewhat forgettable stagehand with a silent, lumbering presence, had quietly harbored an infatuation with Emily for years. He watched from the wings, celebrated all her opening nights, left anonymous notes in her dressing room, a ghostly type of loyalty that was as flattering as it was unsettling. Everyone knew Ethan had a crush, few imagined its depth. Linda Lee, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her marriage to Tom had devolved into silent breakfasts, stiff embraces, and insomniac nights weighted with suspicion. Every glance between Emily and Tom was salt in a wound that would not heal. Every whispered conversation in the wings, Linda took as further proof she was being replaced. She grew brittle, haunted, grasping, convinced her entire life's work was slipping away. Here, at the intersection of these two broken lives, the plan was conceived. After an especially venomous argument with Tom, one in which he threatened to leave her over her paranoia and constant accusations, Linda found herself unable to sleep. She ran into Ethan, sitting alone behind the theater, his face drawn and melancholy. Out of a mixture of rage, humiliation, and desperation, she confided in him about her fears, painting Emily as a constant temptress rather than a victim of circumstance. As the night wore on, one broken heart poured itself into another, and suspicion became conspiracy. The first acts were subtle. Linda encouraged Ethan to keep an eye on Emily, to report back if she and Tom were alone together, to send her warnings if she overstepped her bounds. Ethan, fueled by a misguided sense of gallantry, and a wounded yearning for Emily's attention, obliged. He waited in parking lots, shadowed cast members after rehearsals, and once even left a dead rose in Emily's car, a gesture meant as a warning which instead pushed her into deeper paranoia. None of these actions on their own portended violence. They were desperate, yes, but not criminal. But desperation, left unchecked, has a way of blooming into disaster. The escalation came after closing night, the last time Emily was seen alive. That evening was electric, cast members emotional, the air in the green room thick with congratulations and fatigue. Linda watched Emily and Tom embracing, watched Emily's laughter, and felt decades of hope collapse. Later, drunk on gin and sorrow, she sought Ethan in the alley behind the theater. The conversation, recounted later in scattered remorseful interviews, was a duet of humiliation and confession. Linda spoke of losing Tom, of wishing Emily would go away for good. Ethan interpreted her words as something more, a call to act, a dark favor drowned in the longing to prove himself worthy of Linda's trust. On the night of the murder, Ethan followed Emily as she left rehearsal, clutching her script in a faded green jacket against the chill. He confronted her by her car. The details of what happened next were etched only partially in his memory, adrenaline, fear, and years of rejection fusing into something uncontrollable. Words were exchanged, pleas, denials, accusations. When Emily tried to push past him, a struggle ensued, ending with his hands locked around her neck. He sobbed in his confession, describing a kind of temporary madness, a fugue of jealousy and pain that drove him far past the point of reason. When Emily fell lifeless, Ethan panicked. He dragged her body away from the parking lot, deep into the tangle of cane fields, his breath ragged, his hands shaking violently. The decision to mutilate the body came later, a ghastly attempt, in his addled mind, to buy time, to throw the police off the scent. He was not a seasoned criminal. His actions were frenzied, clumsy, betraying the improvisation of a man entirely out of his depth. Linda's involvement, when finally revealed, was more complicated. While she did not participate directly in Emily's death, her influence on Ethan was undeniable. Weeks of veiled suggestions, desperate warnings, and emotional manipulation had left Ethan unhinged and eager to please her. Court testimony and a trove of retrieved text messages painted a devastating portrait of toxic codependence. In one message, Linda implored Ethan to do whatever it takes to keep her Emily away from Tom. In another, she wrote, "I don't know what I'd do if she were gone. Maybe we could finally be happy again." The depth of her guilt would become one of the case's most debated elements. How much responsibility does someone bear when they do not wield the weapon, but commission the wound through whispers, anger, and fear? For the investigators, the puzzle pieces finally clicked into place as they cross-examined Ethan and Linda. Security footage, overlooked at first, showed Ethan's battered sedan idling near the theater on the fatal night. Surveillance at gas stations along rural outcrops captured his hasty flights after the crime. Receipts, call records, and even a shattered necklace found at the scene all pointed back to a story far more convoluted than a crime of passion or random violence. When detectives sat down with Tom Lee, the shattered husband at the center of this storm, he broke down on the interview room table, guilt and grief tumbling out in equal measure. "I never meant to make anyone suffer. I never thought it would go this far." His sense of responsibility, however misplaced, mirrored the collective trauma now shadowing Austin's theater world. In court, prosecutors painted Ethan and Linda as partners in a psychological crime. He, the instrument; she, the composer. Defense attorneys argued that Ethan was manipulated, a weak-willed man swept up by a far stronger personality. The jury, riveted by weeks of testimony, came to learn not just about the night Emily Carter died, but about the lives lived in fear, jealousy, and yearning. A world where ambition and obsession had blurred into something murderous. The city reeled at the revelations. For many it was easier to believe in a monster than in the tragedy of everyday people, warped by emotion making ruinous choices. The press dubbed the saga the Curtain Call Murder, turning Emily's life and death into headline fodder. But those closest to Emily, Tom, Linda, and even Ethan found no relief in spectacle, only regret and an aching emptiness that art could not fill. Emily's mother, whose steely presence at every hearing became a symbol of parental endurance, articulated what many struggled to admit. "We all played a part, we saw shadows in each other and never asked what darkness might be growing." Her words lingered long after the verdict, echoing through the theater's half-lit corridors and in the silent evenings of Austin's once hopeful community. Ultimately, the truth that emerged behind the velvet curtain was not a single twist or diabolical plot, but a convergence of small heartbreaks, overlooked warnings, and lives left to slip, quietly, off stage. It was a tragedy powered not by evil, but by ordinary people swept up in tides of envy, fear, and longing, until the boundaries between reality and theater blurred irrevocably. As the trial closed and the lights dimmed for the last time on Emily Carter's story, the lesson Austin took with it was bittersweet, that in the shadows beyond the footlights even the most familiar faces can be hiding secrets too painful to ever find the spotlight. Unveiling family tragedy. Beneath the surface of scandal, rumor, and heartbreak that swept through Austin after Emily Carter's murder, there simmered a quieter, older story. The story of Linda Lee and the family legacy she'd tried so hard, and failed so spectacularly, to rewrite. The city's attention focused first on the sizzle of the stage and the lurid details of betrayal, but as weeks turned to months, those closest to the tragedy began to understand that Linda's descent did not begin with a mistake in the wings or a hurried whisper behind velvet curtains. The seeds of heartbreak had taken root long before. Linda grew up in rural central Texas, the adored only daughter of June and Howard Bennett. The Bennetts were a solid working-class family bound by ritual. Sunday morning diner breakfast, tales of family sacrifice, a mother who worked double shifts as a nurse and a father with hands calloused from decades in the auto garage. They drank sweet tea on the porch until the stars came out, and Linda, bright-eyed and imaginative, would recite snatches of poetry or beg her parents to let her audition for school plays. June would smile proudly, hugging her daughter close, while Howard, quieter, would pat her hair and murmur, "Just be careful out there. Stage folks are a different breed." It was in high school drama club that Linda first tasted the intoxicating mix of applause and possibility. She landed lead roles in regional productions, where her raw talent and hard-earned discipline shone. She learned early the rewards of giving the crowd what they wanted, the way applause could make even her toughest days at home shimmer with promise. Howard fretted that theater would break her heart. June bought her dresses for opening nights and clipped every newspaper review. College, for Linda, was a spark and a struggle. She enrolled at the University of Texas, studying theater arts on partial scholarship, her world suddenly much bigger and brasher than the boundaries of her home county. She was awestruck by city lights and the vastness of possibility, but she was also easily bruised by competition, by professors who didn't care about her small-town trophies, by classmates who played dirtier and lived bolder lives. It was at UT she met Tom Lee, a senior, all charm and ambition, his own star burning bright on the student stage. They fell together, a whirlwind of rehearsals, late-night study sessions, and heady post-show parties. Tom was dazzling, a little reckless, beloved by anyone who brushed against his orbit. Linda quickly folded herself into his world, sometimes at the expense of her own goals, believing fervently that shared ambition would always mean shared happiness. When they graduated and moved to Austin proper, Linda's dreams for herself narrowed, just a hair, to accommodate Tom's. She found work backstage and later in production administration, swapping roles she once coveted for supporting those Tom pursued. To family, she painted this choice as practical. To herself, it felt like destiny. After all, Tom was her home now, and the theater was as much an anchor as it was a cage. The applause faded, the crowds shifted, and soon Linda became known as Tom's steadfast partner, reliable, loyal, the glue that kept their personal and professional world together. Outwardly, theirs was the marriage people admired, the power couple of Austin's arts community, building on ambition and creativity. But the rifts that would eventually crack wide open began as barely noticeable: Tom's flirty banter backstage, Linda's simmering insecurity, their mutual exhaustion when the spotlight dimmed. Their home was filled with leftovers, playbills that never made it to scrapbooks, and late-night arguments muffled behind closed doors. The Bennetts watched their daughter's transformation warily. June wrote letters urging Linda to carve out her own happiness, to remember the fearless girl who could silence a room with a Bible verse or recite Shakespeare by heart. Linda tried often to heed that advice. She returned home for holidays, cooked family recipes, called her parents long past midnight when doubts grew loud. But each visit to her childhood home left her more adrift. Her old bedroom was filled with trophies collecting dust, newspaper clippings from a life she'd slipped away from an inch at a time. It was this slow, unyielding drift, from promise, from family, from the sense of being cherished for herself and not just her usefulness, that primed Linda for collapse when she met Emily Carter. Watching Tom's devotion migrate to the young actress, watching her work, her marriage, even her identity contract around insecurities long left unspoken, Linda felt the weight of every sacrifice pressed upon her. When she finally confided to her mother that Tom might leave her for someone younger, June reminded her, "You are not just a wife, you are a person. Don't forget who you were before you played any part." By the time Emily entered their world, Linda's support system was fractured. She pulled away from friends, shied from her parents' encouragement, invested everything in saving what little she believed she had left. Her journal from these months, later entered into evidence, bristled with longing and regret. "He used to love my laugh, now I hear it bounce off the walls and go nowhere." After the murder, as the trial drew near, the Bennetts returned to Austin, heartbreak etched in every expression. Reporters camped outside their motel, eager for a quote from the family who raised the woman at the center of the curtain call murder. But June and Howard refused to feed the spectacle. They spent their days in the courthouse, sitting through hours of testimony, holding each other's hands, sometimes offering a tight, tearful hug to Tom, sometimes walking quietly with Linda during recesses, their daughter's world reduced to nervous whispers with lawyers and the pitiless glare of the public's curiosity. During her sentencing, as details of Linda's unraveling filled the courtroom, June was the only one able to stand behind her daughter. "She was a good girl once," she told a local news anchor through tears, "but sometimes life throws you so far off course, you don't know how to be anyone but the person other people need." The tragedy for those left gathering the pieces was not just in the lost lives or broken dreams. It was in the slow, hidden way a family could fall away from itself, in the force of expectations passed from mother to daughter, in the ache of sacrifice grown so tangled that nobody remembered where love ended and duty began. Howard died 2 years after the trial. June turned inward, and Linda, serving out her sentence, wrote long letters she sometimes never sent, filled with apologies, memories, and the hope that, someday, forgiveness, at least from herself, might be possible. The true curtain fell not on the stage, but on the generations of hope and longing that had shaped Linda Lee. The world would remember the crime, the betrayal, the viciousness of jealousy gone wild. But for those who knew her story from the beginning, the final act was always a family tragedy, written in the faint lines of yearning and the dark ink of dreams abandoned. The Devil's Downfall. When Robert Hanson's carefully woven mask finally unraveled, it wasn't just the end of a criminal's reign, but the culmination of over a decade's worth of fear and unanswered questions for Anchorage. The man who for years fed the town with cinnamon rolls and soft-spoken pleasantries was now unmasked as a methodical killer whose dark legacy stretched across the frozen wilds of Alaska. The tidal wave leading to his downfall surged after Cindy Paulson's daring escape. With cold, hard evidence finally in hand, maps marked with the final resting places of victims, trophies kept as sick mementos, and countless details matching survivors' accounts, police closed in. For years they'd underestimated him. The unremarkable baker with his pudgy frame and shuffling walk never seemed capable of orchestrating the horrors attributed to Alaska's own urban legends. But now the stories had faces, names and facts too damning to ignore. Hansen's arrest sent shockwaves through Anchorage. Residents gathered in stunned knots at the edges of police tape near his bakery, talking in hushed tones. TV crews descended, and headlines blared the unthinkable truth. The city's favorite baker was the Butcher Baker, the man whose name had haunted missing persons reports and late-night rumor for years. There was outrage, confusion, and a collective heavy grief as families realized the fate of loved ones whose absences had once been brushed off or explained away. When interrogated, Hansen's initial calm evaporated once presented with the mountain of evidence. His stutter returned, more severe than ever, and his polite denials crumbled. Faced with irrefutable facts, Cindy's brave testimony, the overwhelming physical evidence, the chilling congruence of his hunting trips and the disappearance timelines, Hansen eventually confessed to the abductions, sexual assaults, and murders of at least 17 women, though many believed the true toll was higher. His accounts were at times chillingly clinical. He described flights into the wilderness, the adrenaline of the hunt, and the dark satisfaction that followed, revealing a psyche as cold and remote as the tundra he prowled. In court, Anchorage saw a different man from the quiet baker they'd known. Hansen appeared small and defeated, no longer the elusive specter but a flesh-and-blood criminal facing hundreds of years behind bars. Prosecutors presented a damning chronology, the painstakingly marked map Hansen had created, the jewelry and possessions taken from his victims as gruesome trophies, and dozens of stories from survivors and grieving loved ones. For the first time, the full extent of his crimes and the scale of the system's failure to stop him sooner came into chilling focus. The trial was short but searing. Judges, police, and even hardened journalists were visibly shaken as evidence was laid bare. The soundproof room in Hansen's home, the bullet casings that matched his weapons, the heartbreaking mementos left behind by missing women. His own wife and children, previously kept in the dark, sat shell-shocked as the public image of their husband and father was revealed to be a monstrous lie. In the end, the verdict was never in doubt. Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke for the city, and, in many ways for the country, when he called Hansen's acts the most cold-blooded and calculated atrocities imaginable. Unlike the vast Alaska wilderness, there would be no more hiding places for Robert Hansen. He was confined to a cell surrounded by cold stone and constant surveillance, the antithesis of the freedom he coveted in life. In prison, Hansen was an object of fascination for criminologists but of horror and revulsion for everyone else. He rarely spoke of his crimes, and those who encountered him said he shrank further into himself as the years wore on. The news occasionally resurfaced, especially when new evidence from Alaska's permafrost threatened to link him to even more unsolved disappearances, but Hansen offered little closure beyond what he'd already confessed. He died behind bars in 2014, in the prison hospital, far from the icy sanctuaries he once roamed. There were no grand gestures, no final dramatic words, just a footnote in the news. For the families of his victims, closure remained elusive, but his death signified the end of Alaska's most terrifying legend. In many ways, Hansen's capture transformed Anchorage. Law enforcement changed. Crimes that were once dismissed received closer scrutiny, especially those involving the city's most vulnerable. The community, haunted by the question of how evil had hid in plain sight, became less trusting, more vigilant. Cultural echoes of Hansen's crimes persisted far beyond Alaska. His story inspired films, books, and countless cautionary tales. Perhaps most importantly, it served as a stark warning that the most monstrous predators can lurk behind the sweetest smiles, and that even in the world's most rugged frontiers, the darkest secrets will one day claw their way into the light.